There is a photograph taken in the summer of 1997 that most people have never seen. Not the glamorous ones from charity galas, not the ones where she is laughing with children in Angola or holding someone's hand in a hospital ward. This photograph was taken on a yacht in the Mediterranean, and in it, Diana, Princess of Wales, is sitting alone at the stern of the boat, her knees pulled slightly toward her chest, her eyes fixed on the horizon. The water behind her stretches endlessly. And the look on her face is not sadness exactly, it is something more complicated than sadness. It is the expression of a woman who has survived something enormous, who has arrived at a strange and unfamiliar shore, and who is not quite sure yet whether she is free or simply lost in a different way. That photograph was taken just weeks before she died. And the thing that stays with you once you have seen it is not how beautiful she looks, though she does. It is how alone she looks. Surrounded by one of the most famous men in the world, with the press circling overhead in helicopters, with literally billions of people across the planet who would have given anything to be near her, Diana Frances Spencer was profoundly, achingly alone. That contradiction, the most loved woman in the world dying in a tunnel in Paris without a single member of her family by her side, is the heart of this story. And it is a story that, even now, more than 25 years later, the world has never quite been able to let go of. If this kind of storytelling moves you, if you find yourself drawn to the complicated lives behind the crowns and the headlines, then you are exactly the kind of person this channel was made for. Stay with us, because this story is only just beginning. To understand how Diana ended up on that yacht in the summer of 1997, you have to go back much further than most people think. You have to go back to a house in Norfolk, England, in the early 1960s, and you have to understand what kind of world she was born into, and what that world did to her before she ever became a princess. Diana Frances Spencer was born on July 1, 1961, the third child of Viscount Althorp and his wife Frances. On the surface, this was an extraordinarily privileged life. The Spencer family were among the oldest and most distinguished aristocratic families in England, their lineage stretching back centuries. They had estates and titles and connections to the royal family that predated almost anyone else in British society. Diana grew up at Park House on the Sandringham estate, a property the family leased from the Queen herself. Her neighbors, in the most literal sense, were the British monarchy. But privilege and happiness are not the same thing, and in the Spencer household, they were often very far apart. When Diana was 6 years old, her mother left. Frances Spencer walked out of the marriage to Viscount Althorp, which in 1967 was a scandal of enormous proportions. Divorce among the aristocracy was not unheard of, but a mother leaving her children, that was something else entirely. The custody battle that followed was vicious and public and deeply traumatic. Frances eventually lost custody of her 4 children, a decision influenced in part by the testimony of Diana's own maternal grandmother, who sided with the Viscount. Frances went on to marry someone else, and Diana was left behind. Think about what that means for a moment. A 6-year-old girl watching her mother drive away down a gravel driveway, not understanding why, not fully understanding that the world she had known had just ended. Diana herself would later describe hearing her younger brother Charles crying himself to sleep at night and not knowing how to comfort him. She was a child trying to hold together a grief she had no language for. What research into early childhood trauma consistently shows is that children who experience abandonment, especially maternal abandonment, often develop what psychologists describe as a profound and lasting hunger for love and reassurance. They become exquisitely attuned to the emotional states of people around them. They develop an almost supernatural capacity for empathy, because as children they learn to read the room in order to survive it. They also, frequently, develop a deep and persistent fear of being left. A terror, buried somewhere beneath every relationship they ever form, that the people they love will eventually go. Diana Spencer grew up carrying all of that, and it would shape every single thing that came after. Her father remarried in 1976, when Diana was 14. His new wife was Rain, Countess of Dartmouth, a forceful and glamorous woman whom Diana and her siblings deeply resented. They called her acid rain. The relationship between stepmother and children was cold at best, hostile at worst. Diana later described feeling like a stranger in her own home. She was not particularly academic, she struggled at school, she failed her O-levels twice, and in a family and social world that valued a certain kind of sharp intellectual achievement, she absorbed the message that she was somehow less than, not clever enough, not quite enough. But she was something else. She was profoundly, instinctively kind. She was warm in a way that people felt physically, like standing near a fire on a cold day. She loved children with a genuineness that was impossible to perform. She worked as a nursery school assistant and a nanny in London in her late teens, and the families she worked for described her as extraordinary with children, endlessly patient, endlessly loving, endlessly present. She was a young woman who had been failed by the adults in her life and who compensated by becoming the most reliable, most loving adult she could possibly be to the children in hers. And then, in the summer of 1980, everything changed. She was 19 years old when Charles, Prince of Wales, began to take notice of her. He was 31. He was the heir to the British throne, under enormous pressure from the palace and from his family, and from the press, and from the entire nation to find a suitable wife and produce an heir. The story that was sold to the public, and to Diana herself to some extent, was a fairy tale. A young, beautiful aristocratic girl catching the eye of the Prince of Wales, a love story written in the stars. The reality was considerably more complicated. Charles had been in love with Camilla Shand, who by this point had become Camilla Parker Bowles, for the better part of a decade. The relationship between Charles and Camilla is one of those love stories that history has treated unkindly in public and more honestly in private. They were genuinely well-suited to each other. They shared interests and a sense of humor and a way of seeing the world. But Camilla had married someone else, and Charles had been sent away on naval duties, and by the time he was ready to consider marriage seriously, Camilla was gone, or was supposed to be gone. Diana knew about Camilla before the engagement. She has said as much. She was not naive, but she was 19 and she was in love or believed herself to be in love, and she believed, as young women in love so often do, that love would be enough to change things. That once they were married, once she was his wife, the history with Camilla would remain history. She was wrong about that, and the cost of being wrong about it would define the next 17 years of her life. The engagement was announced in February 1981, and overnight Diana went from being a relatively unknown nursery school assistant to the most photographed woman on earth. The press attention was immediate and overwhelming, and unlike anything that had ever happened to a private individual in British public life. Photographers followed her everywhere. They camped outside her flat on Coleherne Court. They followed her to the supermarket, to the gym, to work. She was 20 years old and she had no preparation for this, no training, no team of people helping her navigate it. She described being terrified. She described losing weight rapidly, her wedding dress needing to be taken in multiple times because she was growing smaller as the wedding grew closer. She described standing in crowds of people reaching for her and feeling a kind of claustrophobic panic that she had no outlet for. The wedding itself, on July 29, 1981, was watched by 750 million people around the world. It was one of the most watched television events in history. Diana walked down the aisle of St. Paul's Cathedral in a dress with a 25-foot train, and the world looked at her face and saw a fairy tale. She was trembling slightly. Her eyes were red from crying, and most people assumed that was emotion, that she was overwhelmed by joy. But joy was not the only thing Diana was feeling that morning. The marriage began to unravel almost immediately. Charles was attentive in public but distant in private. He had his established world, his friends, his interests, his schedule, and Diana did not quite fit into it. She was young and emotional and desperately in need of connection and reassurance. He was older and reserved and had been trained from birth to suppress emotion and maintain distance. They were not well matched in the ways that matter most inside a marriage. And then there was Camilla. The shadow that never really left. Diana later described discovering, shortly before the wedding, a bracelet that Charles had commissioned for Camilla. a gold bracelet engraved with the letters GF, standing for Girl Friday, which was his nickname for her. She found this, she said, just days before the wedding. She confronted him. He told her it was nothing. She cried with her sisters and told them she could not go through with it, and her sisters told her, gently but firmly, that she had to. Her face was already on the tea towels. That detail, the face on the tea towels, is one of the most heartbreaking in the entire story. She was already a product before she had made any choice at all. She was already an institution, a symbol, a national story. She was 20 years old, and she was already, in a very real sense, no longer entirely her own person. The early years of the marriage saw Diana struggling with something that would not be publicly named for years. She was suffering from bulimia, a condition she described in extraordinary detail in the interviews she later gave. She talked about the loneliness of it, the way it became a coping mechanism for feelings she had nowhere else to put. She talked about how 4 or 5 times a day she would eat compulsively and then purge, and how the royal household around her responded, not with concern but with irritation. She talked about self-harm. She talked about throwing herself against a glass cabinet. She talked about throwing herself down a staircase when she was pregnant with William. She talked about asking for help and not getting it. What makes this so painful is not just the suffering itself, but what it tells us about the institution Diana had married into. The British royal family in the 1980s was not equipped, and perhaps not willing, to deal with mental health in any meaningful way. Stiff upper lip was not just a cliché. It was a survival mechanism that had been passed down through generations, and within that culture, Diana's emotional openness, her need to talk about what she was feeling, was treated as a problem, as a weakness, as something embarrassing and inconvenient. She was not wrong. She was just in the wrong place. The births of William in 1982 and Harry in 1984 gave Diana something she had been searching for her entire life: unconditional love. She adored her boys with everything she had. She broke royal protocol constantly in her insistence on being a hands-on mother. She drove them to school herself. She took them to theme parks and McDonald's and video arcades. She brought them to hospitals and shelters and homeless projects, deliberately exposing them to the realities of the world outside the palace gates. She wanted them to understand what it felt like to be ordinary. She wanted them to feel empathy for people whose lives were nothing like theirs. She was parenting from her wound, in the most generous possible way. In the mid-1980s, as the marriage continued to deteriorate, Diana began to find her own voice in public life. The moment that crystallized it for many people happened in 1987, when she shook hands with an AIDS patient at a London hospital. This sounds almost impossibly simple now, but in 1987, AIDS was a disease so terrified of, so stigmatized, so completely misunderstood, that the gesture was revolutionary. At a time when people believed, or pretended to believe, that you could contract HIV through casual contact, the Princess of Wales reached out and took the hand of a dying man, without gloves, with the cameras watching, and the world noticed. That was not a staged moment. That was not a public relations decision made by a team of advisors. That was Diana Spencer, acting on instinct, acting on the empathy that had been forged in the crucible of her own pain. She saw someone who was suffering and isolated and treated as untouchable, and she refused to treat them that way. She had been isolated herself. She understood what it felt like to be invisible inside a room full of people. The late 1980s saw the marriage reach a point of complete breakdown. Both Charles and Diana had formed relationships outside the marriage. Diana's relationship with cavalry officer James Hewitt became one of the great tabloid stories of the decade. Charles had never really ended things with Camilla. The palace knew. The press largely knew, and the British public, who had invested so completely in the fairy tale, was being kept, for as long as possible, in a form of managed ignorance. But things were falling apart in ways that could not be managed indefinitely. In 1992, Andrew Morton's biography Diana, her true story was published, and it detonated like a bomb in the middle of the British establishment. Morton had conducted secret recordings with Diana herself, recordings made in her private apartments, in which she described the reality of her marriage with devastating candor. The bulimia, the self-harm, the loneliness, the affairs, the complete failure of the institution around her to respond to her suffering with any kind of compassion. Morton claimed, and the palace denied, that the book had Diana's full cooperation. Years later, after Diana died, Morton released the actual recordings. The voice on the tape was unmistakably hers. The book caused an earthquake. The public was shocked, then divided. Some people read it and felt a surge of sympathy for Diana so powerful it surprised them. Others felt a surge of loyalty to Charles. Others were simply angry at the exposure, at the messiness of it, at the unraveling of a fairy tale they had wanted to keep intact. The palace was furious. The Queen was reportedly deeply unhappy. And Diana, who had authorized a secret book about her own life from within the walls of her husband's family's home, found herself in a position of extraordinary danger. The separation of Charles and Diana was formally announced in December 1992. Prime Minister John Major made the announcement in the House of Commons. The statement was careful, dignified, managed. It said that the separation was amicable and that there were no plans to divorce. Behind the scenes, the reality was a war. The palace had a communications apparatus. It had allies in the press. It had centuries of experience managing its image. Diana had a flat in Kensington Palace and a phone and a very small number of people she trusted. And yet, somehow, she was winning. The public's love for Diana did not diminish with the separation. If anything, it deepened. Because what Morton's book had done, what Diana's own gradual honesty had done, was transform her from a fairy tale princess into something more real and more powerful. She was no longer just beautiful and glamorous and sad. She was brave. She was a woman who had been through something genuinely terrible, and who was still standing and still reaching out, and still caring for people who were suffering. She was, to millions of people who had their own private sufferings, and their own family failures, and their own moments of feeling invisible, a mirror. She was proof that you could survive it. The years between the separation in 1992 and the divorce in 1996 were a strange and turbulent chapter in Diana's life. She was still technically a member of the royal family, still carrying out public engagements, still living at Kensington Palace. But she was also being systematically diminished by the palace machine. Her security detail was reduced. Her staff were questioned. Her phone was tapped. She described feeling, during this period, as though she was being watched and monitored and slowly dismantled. Then came the Panorama interview. On November 20th, 1995, Diana sat down with BBC journalist Martin Bashir in a room at Kensington Palace, and she gave an interview that remains, to this day, one of the most remarkable pieces of television ever broadcast. She wore very little makeup. She let her eyes be vulnerable. She talked about the marriage, about Camilla, about her own affair with Hewitt, which she acknowledged with a directness that stunned the nation. She talked about her mental health, about the bulimia, about the self-harm, about the loneliness. She questioned, with quiet but unmistakable precision, whether Charles was suited to be king, and she said something that has echoed ever since. She said she wanted to be a queen of people's hearts. 50 million people in the UK watched that interview. The reaction was overwhelming. The palace was incandescent with fury. The Queen, reportedly, watched it with a coldness that those present described as unlike anything they had seen in her. And within weeks, the Queen wrote personally to both Charles and Diana, urging them to proceed with a divorce as quickly as possible. The message was clear. Diana had become a problem, and problems were to be resolved. The divorce was finalized in August 1996. Diana lost the title Her Royal Highness, which had been a condition insisted upon by the palace and which she felt as a profound humiliation. She retained the title Princess of Wales. She received a substantial financial settlement. She was given continued residence at Kensington Palace. But she was, in the most official sense possible, out. She was no longer a working member of the royal family. She was on her own. And what she did with that freedom is one of the most remarkable final chapters in the story of any public figure in modern history. In the last year and a half of her life, freed from the constraints and the protocols and the managed silences of the royal family, Diana threw herself into humanitarian work with an energy and a focus that was almost ferocious. She had always cared. But now, finally, she could act on that caring without asking anyone's permission. The landmines campaign is the piece of this that most people remember. In January 1997, Diana traveled to Angola with the Red Cross. She walked through fields where landmines lay hidden in the earth. She met children who had lost limbs. She held them. She sat with them in the dirt. She wore a protective visor and a vest and walked through cleared areas of minefields, and the photographs of her doing this went around the world. The response from the British establishment was hostile in ways that revealed a great deal about how she was perceived. The Foreign Secretary at the time described her as a loose cannon. Members of Parliament criticized her for interfering in matters of politics and foreign policy. They said she was simplifying a complex issue. They said she was grandstanding. What they were really saying was that she was powerful and that they had not sanctioned that power. Because the landmines campaign worked. Diana's involvement helped shift public opinion in ways that lobbying and policy papers could not. The Ottawa Treaty, signed later that year banning anti-personnel mines, was a direct political result of sustained public pressure, and that pressure had a face and a name and a pair of eyes that the world trusted. Diana's involvement was not incidental. It was central. She also traveled to Bosnia, to Pakistan, to other places where suffering was happening in full view of the world's cameras. She visited leprosy patients. She sat with people who had AIDS when almost no one still would. She did these things not because someone told her to, not because they were strategically useful, but because she believed that proximity to suffering was what compassionate human beings owed each other. You showed up. You took the hand. You did not look away. At the same time, Diana's personal life was entering a new and publicly scrutinized chapter. Her relationship with heart surgeon Hasnat Khan, which lasted nearly 2 years, was the one she spoke of most tenderly. Khan was a Pakistani-born doctor working in London, deeply private, opposed to the media attention that Diana brought with her everywhere she went. He did not want to be famous. He did not want to be photographed. He wanted a quiet life and a meaningful career, and being in a relationship with the Princess of Wales was incompatible with all of that. Diana apparently loved him deeply. She was said to have consulted Imran Khan, the former Pakistani cricketer and later politician, about the cultural aspects of a possible marriage. She reportedly considered converting to Islam. She imagined a life with him that was quieter, more grounded, more ordinary than anything she had known since she was a teenager. But Hasnat Khan could not reconcile the relationship with the life he wanted. They broke up in the summer of 1997. And within weeks, Diana was on a yacht in the Mediterranean with Dodi Fayed. The relationship with Dodi Fayed, son of Mohammed Al Fayed, the Egyptian businessman who owned Harrods and the Ritz Paris among other things, began in July 1997 when Mohammed Al Fayed invited Diana and her sons to join the family on a summer holiday in the south of France. William and Harry were there, swimming and laughing and being teenagers. Diana was there, beautiful in a swimsuit, the cameras always somehow finding her even on a private yacht. And Dodi, charming and attentive and extraordinarily wealthy, was there too. What exactly the relationship was in those weeks is something that people have argued about endlessly. Dodi had been engaged to someone else just months before. Diana had just come through the end of her relationship with Hasnat Khan. Some people who knew them both said the relationship was real, that Diana genuinely cared for Dodi, that she was happy in a way she had not been in a long time. Others said she was using the relationship to make Hasnat jealous, that the public displays of affection on the yacht were partly performance. The truth, as with most things about Diana, is probably more complicated and more human than either of those versions. She was a 36-year-old woman who had been through an enormous amount, who was newly free, who was trying to figure out what her life looked like now, and who found in Dodi Fayed's company something that felt good. Whether it would have lasted, whether it would have grown into something lasting and real, is one of the unanswerable questions in the story, because it did not get the chance to become anything at all. In August 1997, Diana returned to London briefly, and the city felt the weight of what was coming without knowing it. She had meetings and appointments. She saw her sons, who were preparing to return to school. There are accounts of her final conversations with William and Harry, who were at Balmoral with their father and their grandparents. She spoke to Harry on the phone on the afternoon of August 30th. He was 13 years old. She told him she loved him and that she would see him soon. She was 36 years old. She had no idea that she would not. On the evening of August 30th, 1997, Diana and Dodi Fayed were in Paris. They had been to the Ritz Hotel, owned by Mohammed Al Fayed, where they had eaten dinner in the Imperial Suite to avoid the photographers waiting in the restaurant below. After dinner, they left the hotel through the rear entrance, attempting to avoid the paparazzi who had been tracking them throughout the trip. The car was a black Mercedes S280. The driver was Henry Paul, the deputy head of security at the Ritz. Also in the car was Trevor Rees-Jones, a bodyguard, riding in the front passenger seat. Diana and Dodi were in the back. What happened in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel in Paris in the early hours of August 31st, 1997, has been the subject of official investigations, conspiracy theories, books, films, and arguments that have never entirely ended. What is established is this: the car entered the tunnel at high speed with photographers on motorcycles in pursuit. Inside the tunnel, the car lost control. It struck the 13th pillar of the tunnel. The impact was catastrophic. Dodi Fayed died at the scene. Henry Paul died at the scene. Trevor Rees-Jones, the bodyguard, survived. Diana was alive when the first responders reached her. She was unconscious but breathing. The French medical system operates under a principle of stabilizing patients at the scene before transporting them, which meant that Diana remained at the crash site for some time while paramedics worked on her. She was then transported to the Pitié-Salpêtrière hospital, where surgeons worked on her for several hours. At 4 a.m. on August 31st, 1997, Diana, Princess of Wales, was pronounced dead. The cause was internal bleeding from a torn pulmonary vein, a result of the trauma of the crash. She was 36 years old. When the news broke, the world did something it had never quite done before. It stopped. The reaction to Diana's death was not a normal public grieving. It was something larger and stranger and more powerful than that. It was a collective emotional event of a kind that took everyone by surprise, including the people who were trying to manage it. People went to Kensington Palace and left flowers. Then more people came and left more flowers. Then the flowers became a carpet, a river, an ocean, stretching away from the gates of the palace across the sidewalks and into the park. People stood in line for hours, for days, to sign books of condolence. People wept in public who had never met her, who had never been near her, who had seen her only on television and in photographs. The grief was real. That is the thing that must be understood. It was not performance. It was not hysteria, though it was sometimes described that way, particularly by those who were bewildered or threatened by its scale. It was real grief, the kind that comes when you lose someone who mattered to you, who made you feel seen, who gave you permission to believe that compassion was not weakness, that vulnerability was not failure. Diana had done that for people. Quietly, consistently, across 17 years of public life. She had stood in rooms where people were suffering, and she had not turned away. She had shaken hands that no one else would shake. She had held children that the powerful world around her had decided to ignore. And in doing so, she had told millions of ordinary people something they needed to hear: that they mattered, that they were worth the attention of someone important, that suffering did not make you invisible. When she died, those people mourned her the way you mourn someone who knew you. Even if she never knew their names. The royal family's response to Diana's death became its own crisis, and one of the defining moments of the British monarchy in the modern era. In the days immediately following the crash, the royal family remained at Balmoral in Scotland. The Queen did not return to London. There was no flag flown at half-mast over Buckingham Palace, because the protocol at the time was that flags were only flown over royal residences when the monarch was in residence, and the monarch was not there. To the public, this looked like coldness. It looked like indifference. The grief of the nation was enormous and visible and palpable, and the royal family seemed to be above it, behind their walls and their protocols and their ancient rules. The public began to turn. The anger was quiet but unmistakable, and those inside the palace who were paying attention recognized that something genuinely serious was happening to the institution's relationship with its people. Prince Charles flew to Paris to bring Diana's body home. He brought her sisters, Jane and Sarah. He stood at the tarmac and received the coffin with a dignity that those present described as genuine and grief-stricken. William and Harry were 13 and 12, boys, children, and they were told their mother was dead, and asked to carry it with a composure that no child should ever be asked to carry. The image of those two boys walking behind their mother's coffin on September 6, 1997, is one of the most haunting images of the late 20th century. They walked for what felt like miles, the whole route of the funeral procession, heads slightly bowed, faces composed in a way that looked like tremendous effort. William, the elder, occasionally glancing sideways at his brother, as though checking to make sure Harry was still there, still holding. Harry, younger, smaller, his face a mask over something that must have been unbearable. It was a Friday. 1 billion people around the world watched the funeral on television. Elton John sang a rewritten version of Candle in the Wind in the Abbey, the original song retitled Goodbye England's Rose. He was crying as he played. The congregation was crying. People gathered on the streets outside, watching on screens, were crying. The flowers people had brought were so numerous that they had to be cleared away by teams of volunteers working through the nights. Earl Spencer, Diana's brother Charles, gave a eulogy that was itself an extraordinary act of public defiance. He spoke of his sister with a love and a specificity that made her real and present in a way that official tributes never quite manage. And then, in the final section of the speech, he turned his attention to the royal family, without naming them, and he spoke about what he called the real Diana, whom he accused the institution of misunderstanding and misusing. He promised that he and his family, the Spencers, would ensure that Diana's sons grew up understanding who their mother really was. He promised that they would be raised with their mother's warmth and her humanity. The applause that began in the crowd outside the Abbey, where people were watching on screens, rippled through the walls and into the Abbey itself, where the congregation, inside a church where applause was simply not done, began to applaud. The royals did not. Charles, sitting a few rows away, sat very still. That moment said something about Diana that no official statement ever could. She belonged to the people in a way that the institution could never fully claim. She was theirs before she was the monarchy's, and she remained theirs in death. In the years and decades since Diana died, the questions around her death have never fully quieted. The official conclusion, reached by multiple investigations, including an extensive British inquiry called Operation Paget, and the inquest that concluded in 2008, is that the crash was the result of an accident. Henry Paul had been drinking, and toxicology reports showed a significant level of alcohol in his blood. He was also found to have been on prescription medications. He was driving at high speed through a tunnel in pursuit conditions, and the car crashed. The conspiracy theories that grew up around the crash are numerous and various. Some involve the British intelligence services. Some involve the royal family. Some involve Mohammed Al-Fayed's claims, which he made publicly and persistently until his own death in 2023, that Diana and Dodi were murdered because they were planning to get engaged and Diana was pregnant. The official investigations found no evidence to support these claims. But the conspiracy theories persist, not only because of what they claim, but because of what they reveal about how deeply Diana's death affected people. When someone matters that much, when the loss is that sudden and that violent and that complete, the human mind resists the idea that it was just an accident. Accidents are random and meaningless, and they do not make sense of a grief that large. The need for an explanation, for a cause, for someone to blame, is a very human response to a loss that feels impossible. Diana herself would perhaps have understood that. She spent much of her life absorbing the grief of strangers. She knew something about the need to put impossible feelings somewhere. The aftermath of Diana's death changed Britain in ways that are still being felt. The monarchy underwent a significant shift in how it presented itself to the public. The Queen, in a rare and remarkable television address, spoke directly to the nation about Diana, describing her as an exceptional and gifted human being. She acknowledged, carefully, that there were lessons to be learned. The palace's walls came down, at least a little. The emotional register of the royal family's public interactions changed, subtly but measurably, in the years that followed. Diana's sons grew up carrying their mother's death in ways that both have spoken about with increasing candor as adults. Prince Harry's memoir, Spare, published in 2023, contains passages about his mother and her death that are as raw and unfiltered as anything that has come from that family since Diana herself spoke to Martin Bashir in 1995. Harry writes about walking behind the coffin and feeling completely surreal, about having been told not to cry, about the suppression of grief that was required of him at 12 years old, and the cost of that suppression over the years that followed. He writes about going back to the tunnel in Paris as an adult, standing in the place where it happened, trying to make it real. William has spoken about his mother with more restraint but no less feeling. He has invoked her memory in his work on mental health, on conservation, on homelessness. He named his daughter Charlotte Diana, preserving a version of the name she never chose for herself. When Catherine, his wife, was photographed sitting with their children in a manner that reminded the world of Diana's warmth and accessibility, the comparison was made immediately and instinctively, because the world is still measuring things against Diana, still using her as the standard for what a princess can and should be. The Diana standard, the idea that a royal can be both fully human and fully committed, that titles and protocol need not require the abandonment of empathy. That you can walk into a room where people are suffering and sit down beside them without checking first whether the optics are right. She did all of that, not because it was strategic, but because she had suffered herself, and she refused to let that suffering make her hard. There is something else worth sitting with as this story comes toward its close, something about the particular loneliness of being profoundly loved by millions and deeply misunderstood by the people closest to you. Diana had both of those things in extraordinary measure. She had the adoration of a world. She was on magazine covers and in news broadcasts and on commemorative teacups. Strangers wept when they saw her. Children reached for her hands, and she had a marriage that made her feel invisible, a family-in-law that treated her illness as inconvenience. A system that tried, over and over, to manage and contain and diminish her. She had the bizarre experience of being the most recognized face on the planet, while feeling that no one in her immediate world actually saw her. What she found, in her work, in her humanitarian campaigns, in the moments she spent with the dying and the suffering and the forgotten, was something that the gilded world she had married into could not give her. She found reciprocity. She showed up for people, and they showed up for her. The woman in the AIDS ward who held her hand, the child in Angola who looked up at her with eyes full of trust. The ordinary people who wrote her letters by the thousands, telling her she had helped them survive something, that she had made them feel less alone. She saved people with her attention. And being needed in that way, being genuinely useful to someone who had nothing to offer in return except gratitude, gave her a sense of worth that the palaces and the tiaras had never managed to provide. She was 36 when she died. 36 is so young. It is an age at which most people are only beginning to understand themselves. Diana had already lived 3 or 4 lives by the time she was 36. She had been the motherless girl in Norfolk, the nursery school assistant in London, the nervous bride in St. Paul's, the isolated princess in Kensington Palace, the patient in the clinic, the woman being watched and managed and diminished, the landmines campaigner in Angola, the woman on the yacht squinting into the horizon and wondering what came next. She never found out what came next. That is the thing that stays with you. The story of Diana is a story that did not get its final chapter. She was in the middle of becoming something in the last months of her life. She was freer than she had ever been. She was more purposeful than she had ever been. She was beginning, perhaps for the first time, to be the author of her own story rather than a character in someone else's. And then the tunnel. There is a memorial to Diana in Kensington Gardens, not far from the palace where she lived. It was unveiled in 2004, and it is, unlike most royal memorials, not a statue. It is a fountain. Water moves through it in circuits, flowing from the top down through channels and cascades and still pools. You can walk alongside it, you can sit beside it, children can wade in it. It is designed to be touched, to be experienced, to be lived in rather than observed from a respectful distance. It is a living, moving, accessible thing. It is very Diana. And on any given day, you can go there and find people standing quietly beside the water, sometimes alone, sometimes with children, sometimes with their eyes full of something that looks like private feeling. They are not all old enough to remember her. Some of them were born after she died, and yet they came. They come. They keep coming. Because what Diana represented, what she embodied, what she proved with her presence and her choices and her refusal to let suffering make her cruel, is something that people are still hungry for. The idea that love and power are not incompatible, that a person can stand at the center of the world's attention and use it not for themselves, but for the people who have no attention at all. That vulnerability is not a weakness but a form of courage. That the most human thing you can do, in the middle of your own pain, is reach out your hand to someone who is also in pain. She knew that. She knew it not from books or training or political strategy. She knew it from living. From the girl crying at the window when her mother drove away. From the teenager who felt stupid and clumsy in a world that valued brilliance and grace. From the young woman who asked for help inside the palace and was told, essentially, to be quiet and carry on. She knew it from the inside, the way you only know something when it has cost you something, and she gave it back. She gave it all back, to the strangers in the hospitals and the children in the minefields and the hundreds of millions of people who watched her from a distance and felt, somehow, that she was looking back. That was her gift. And it did not die in the tunnel. It is still here, in the way her sons speak about kindness and about mental health and about the cost of keeping things hidden. In the way Catherine, Princess of Wales, sat in a hospital room during her own illness and wrote a quiet letter to a sick child she had never met, because she knew what her mother-in-law knew, that proximity to suffering matters. In the way that, every year on the anniversary of Diana's death, people still bring flowers to the gates of Kensington Palace, not because they were told to, because they want to. The most loved woman in the world died in a tunnel with no family by her side, in a foreign city, in the small hours of a summer morning, 36 years old, and in the middle of becoming. That is the unbearable truth at the center of this story. And it is also, somehow, not the whole truth, because she is still here, in everything she changed, and everyone she touched, and every child her sons will raise in her image. She asked to be the queen of people's hearts, and the people said yes. And they have never said anything different since.